Hi and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be giving you a tutorial on how to paint those Crippled God Foundry miniature bases. Again, this is something where I'm gearing it more towards beginners, but for everyone, you can check in and see some of the techniques that I use to get these bases to look like dungeon floors. So stay tuned, I'm going to show you how to do this step by step. I do recommend that you make sure you watch that first video, and again, I'm going to make sure that link is right there for you to make it easy to get to, because there is some crossover with techniques. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me down below. For now, let's get started. I'll see you later. Bye! Supplies listed in the description below. Links are provided whenever possible. I'm showing you the specific paints that I use personally just to help out those who want to do this exactly. The one thing I do want to mention about these paints is that they are craft acrylic paints. They're not necessarily model paints for miniatures. However, I am able to use these with great success. In fact, I use them on all of my minis. You may have some who feel that you should buy standard model paints, which is perfectly fine, but the focus right now is to get people into painting in the first place. And I find these are a little bit more approachable for people because you can find them everywhere. As for these paintbrushes, these are ones that I purchased in the craft section of Walmart. You want to make sure you have a wide, flat brush. It makes it much easier to put the base coat onto the bases. You also want to have something that's a little bit smaller, also a flat style brush. This is good for starting to get the paint colors onto the bases, especially in a dry brush technique. Then you also want to make sure you have a couple of detail brushes on hand for those smaller details that are on a couple of the bases that I'm using in this video. The first base from Crippled God Foundry that I want to use is the 35mm dungeon base, and this is because it's just the basic floor, which is a great way to get started and see some of these techniques put together. Everything you're going to see in this section is applicable to the other two bases featured in this video. So the first thing you want to make sure you do is clean your base. You want to make sure you get off any residual oils or release agent that you will find on these pieces. Once that's dried and cleaned, something I like to do is I will take an old pill bottle, fill up the bottom with a little bit of sand, put the cap back on, then just taking that blue tack, put that under the base and stick the base on top of the bottle cap. The next thing you want to do is get a base layer on. Now for this base layer, I mix together a little bit of that jet black with a little bit of the chocolate bar and another little bit of Mod Podge matte. And you want to put a layer on this. It doesn't need to be a thick layer. In fact, you can see the white showing through on the base. That's a good thing. So you get this base layer on, you're going to find it helps the paints adhere a lot better. Important thing to keep in mind is you want this layer to dry completely before we move on to the next step. Sponging is a technique I find extremely helpful, especially when painting terrain and certain minis. In this case, though, with minis, you don't want to reach for a classic kitchen sponge or something of the like because oftentimes the texture on that is too large. What you want to do for a mini-based sponging technique is use a cosmetic sponge, and they come in these little wedge shapes. What you need to do is with your fingernails rip off bits of the bottom of the sponge so you get this textured look at the bottom. You can also save those bits and coat them with some Mod Podge and paint. It actually looks like rubble. Little tip on the side. Once the bits are off, what you want to then do is take either a twist tie or a pipe cleaner, wrap it around the middle area of the sponge, and this is going to cause the base of the sponge to bow out a little bit, which will help make sure that texture gets everywhere you need it to be. For the next part of this process, it helps to have your paints on a paper plate. This is the basic technique. You're going to first dip the sponge in the paint, blot it off a little bit, then go onto your paper plate and just dab it a couple times and see how the paint looks on that. When you get a texture you like the look of, you can then move that onto the mini. A little paint does go a very long way. Using that same dabbing technique that you did on the paper plate, you're going to first start with a dark gray colored paint and you're going to dab that on the base. Do make sure you get the top and the sides of the base while you're doing this. You do not want complete coverage with this. I'd say give this a good about 60% coverage to 80% coverage depending on how heavy your use of the sponge is. When that first coating has had a chance to dry a little bit, you're going to move on to using that graphite or a very light gray paint, again using the sponging technique, and in this case you do not need to put on as much as before. I'd leave it to no more than about 40% coverage of this particular color on the base. Next up, you're going to sponge with a light brown or the cafe latte colored paint, and again no more than about 30 to 20% coverage on this one. Each time you leave a little less paint to allow the other paint colors through. This creates a sense of depth and texture that you'll see in natural stone. Again, be sure to get the sides while you're doing this and don't just focus on the top. Please check the link above to see the exact dry brush technique in a different video, but what you're going to do next is once everything has dried with a beige colored or a parchment paint, you are going to take that color and dry brush across the top and the sides of the base to start bringing out those details a little bit more. Now, a little supply note for beginners, I find that this is a really great paintbrush cleaner. I do recommend you get it. The link is below for you. When your dry brush is dry, what you want to make sure you do is do your wash at this point. In this case, to show you how different color washes can change the look of something, I went with a deep blue wash. I actually used Citadel's Nightshade, and I find that one to work very nicely on stone floors, especially if you want a slate light look. So you put the wash on, let it sit and dry completely before we move on. Now, because a wash can tend to mute things, what you're going to do is do one more round of dry brush with the beige, the parchment color that I use specifically, and you're going to go back around and dry brush, and this time make sure you focus on highlighting the edges of the base as well as any higher areas on the base itself to really make those stone bits stand out. Now we're going to look at the 50mm broken door base. Now, since these are very similar to each other, it's pretty much the same steps as you have just seen with the dungeon floor base. There's going to be a little bit extra because of the broken door itself. So make sure you go through the same exact process as you would before up until we get to the bits of the door. However, you will not do the wash yet. Using one of those detail brushes, you are going to go back to those door bits and take that chocolate bar or a dark brown color paint and paint the door pieces. Try to avoid the areas where there are those bits of metal. When you have the door part painted, you're then going to move on to the bits of metal area. I wanted this to have more of that wrought iron look, so I decided to go with a jet black. You can also do a very dark gray or a pavement type color of paint in this case. Allow these bits to dry completely before we move on to the next step of enhancing the door bits. Here is where we are now going to add the wash, and in this case I went with a dark brown wash, in this case Citadel's Agrax Earthshade. But again, make it a brown tone wash in this case, and as you can see, it also changes the tone that you see in the stone itself, which I wanted you to see in this step. And now we come to the dry brushing on the door bits. So what you're going to do is you are first going to, with the light brown or the cafe latte, you're going to dry brush across the grain of the wood to enhance the grain texture. When you're done with the wood, you're then going to move on to the metal, and in this case I used that gunmetal gray metallic, and again dry brush over that to enhance the texture of the metal pieces. The last thing you want to do is take your ivory colored paint or your antique white in this case, and you are going to do a dry brush along the stone areas of this base to bring out the edges and the raised bits of stone in this case. Now let's take a look at our skull base. To get the skull base ready, kind of the same idea, except you're only going to use that dark or chocolate bar brown with Mod Podge mixed together. Coat the base entirely. You will need to take your paintbrush and make sure you poke that paint into the nooks and crannies of the skulls that are on top of this base. Allow it to dry completely before moving on. We are skipping the sponging technique and moving right on to dry brush. So you're going to dry brush a beige or the parchment on the skulls themselves, and where you have stone, you are going to dry brush on with the dark gray or the graphite gray in this case. Then taking a detail brush, you're going to go back to where the bits of wood are showing through and paint those a dark brown or the chocolate bar brown that I showed you before. And in this case, I used the same wash as I used on the broken door base. When the wash is completely dry, we're going to go back to doing some more dry brushing. In this case, the skulls should get a dry brush with some ivory colored paint, in this case the vanilla ice cream. Don't forget to also get the wood texture with the light brown of the cafe latte, and then finally go back to the stone areas and use a light gray on those areas, again to highlight the details around the stone area of the base. I highly recommend that you do seal your bases before putting any minis on top of them. One thing I do like to use, if you have a whole bunch to do at the same time, is the Krylon Max Crystal Clear, or you can just do a simple mixture of water mixed with Mod Podge so it's the consistency of skim milk. And here we have our final look at the 3 different bases. Again, these are all bases I wanted to show you because they have a very similar approach to them each, and they all use very similar colors. So if these are bases that you've purchased from Crippled God Foundry or have bases of a similar look, this is an approach you can take with them. I hope this has given you some things to work with, especially if you are new to the concept of painting with miniatures. Again, you're always free to comment below if you have any questions, or you can email me at thecraftingmuse.email@gmail.com. Please make sure to hit that like button if you could, and you're welcome to subscribe while you're here. For now, that's it for me, and I'll be back with another video in a week. Take care, and thanks so much for watching.
Painting bases. Painting bases, take 1. Yo! Sorry, I read a book about orangutans last night, kind of tapping into that behavior. However, there are some tips in here that there are tips in here. There's some tips in here and such. There you go. Okay, we're good. Kaboom! I am not raising children. I am raising elephants. True story. Okay. Let's see.